I'd like to welcome everybody to Season 2 of Connecticut River Conservancy's live stream series. We're launching the new year with hydropower in New Hampshire and Vermont, 3 dams, 2 states, 1 better deal for rivers. My name is Stacy Leonard, and I'm the events coordinator here at CRC. We really appreciate you tuning in today when there are so many large issues attracting our attention. These live streams have been a great means of bringing our work and our rivers to you wherever you may reside. We're excited to bring a new season of offerings in the weeks and months ahead on topics such as how we test our waterways for bacteria and microplastics, how the Connecticut River formed and shaped the land around it, how to combat invasive species and become a community science volunteer, to name a few. You can find all of this information on our website at ctriver.org/livestream. And I'll be sharing this link in a follow-up email and all the resources that have to do with our presentation today after the presentation. Before we move on, I want to let you know that we are recording this presentation for later access, and it will be posted on our website within 24 hours. We really encourage your questions. This is a big topic. And we'll field them at the end of the program. So you can type them into the chat box and we'll answer as many as we have time for. All right, if you've come today to better understand the complexity of hydro relicensing and how you can get involved, you're in the right place. This presentation is the first of 2 on the topic, focusing today on the 3 major hydroelectric dams in Vermont and New Hampshire, and in 2 weeks on facilities in Massachusetts. So we hope you'll join us for that as well. Relicensing comes up once every 40 to 50 years, and there's a lot at stake for the preservation and conservation of aquatic animals, humans, and culture. CRC has been advocating for stronger protections for our river for the better part of 9 years in this process. We'll be led on the journey today by Kathy Urffer, CRC River Steward in New Hampshire and Vermont, and Katie Kennedy, applied river scientist with the Nature Conservancy based in Western Mass. Kathy Urffer advocates for our rivers around multiple aspects, including aquatic habitat, water quality, recreation, and transparent public involvement to protect our public trust resource. Katie Kennedy's work involves understanding the impacts of river management decisions on river ecology and function, and finding solutions that benefit multiple water users. Also on the line is Andrea Donlon, our Massachusetts River Steward, who leads our efforts on relicensing in Massachusetts. And she'll be leading that next live stream January 27th and helping answer your questions today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kathy to lead us on. Thanks for being here.
Great, thanks, Stacy, and thanks so much for everyone who is attending today. I see people who are still being admitted from the waiting room coming in. So I will dive right in here. We're going to start with a little bit of background just to make sure everybody is up to speed, and we want to start with why we care, essentially. So we are working in the Connecticut River watershed, and there's a long history of dams for industrial uses. And so our waters are heavily impacted by dams. And some of the ecological impacts of dams, when you have a free-flowing river, you have the water that is being oxygenated, it stays cool, the fish are able to pass. When you add dams to any river system, certain things happen automatically. It starts to slow the water down, the water will drop sediment, which changes the habitat at the bottom. It will warm the water because it's not being aerated the same way. So the dissolved oxygen levels can be impacted. And, in big reservoirs, there is an opportunity where the different layers may be heated at different levels. So there's a lot of ecological impacts of dams, and fish can't migrate up and down around obstacles. And so that's really where we're starting from, why we care, why dams are a problem. We have hydro dams, which have additional issues, but they also provide a benefit in that they generate electricity for us. So a little background on FERC, not a curse word, stands for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the federal agency that issues licenses for hydroelectric facilities, for most of the hydroelectric facilities. The license terms are generally from 30 to 50 years. So when we say we have a once in a lifetime opportunity, we mean it. The way I see this is a contract with the public to use our public resource waterways to generate electricity, also in the public interest, but often for profit companies. So we have this opportunity, once every 30 to 50 years to revisit this contract and decide if it is still in the public's best interest for this to occur. The licenses we're talking about today were last updated in 1979. And a little background on the federal legislation. So FERC is required to provide equal consideration for many different uses of the waterway. And that includes power and development, electrical generation, energy conservation, the protection of our fish and wildlife species and endangered species, recreational opportunities, and preservation of other aspects of environmental health. So water quality, things like that. So you could think of this as like multiple federal regulations that sit on par with each other, and the license is supposed to address all of those. And so some of the other federal laws that come into play are the Federal Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and National Historic Preservation Act. And then recreation, because it's a big part of our economy, has also been included as an important value as we consider licensing. So to dig in a little bit on these particular projects, we collectively have been working on these since they started in 2012. And you have the Wilder Dam, which is up in Wilder, Vermont, and Lebanon, New Hampshire. The Bellows Falls Dam in Bellows Falls, Vermont, and Walpole, New Hampshire. The Vernon Dam, which is in the river between Vernon and Hinsdale. These three facilities are owned by Great River Hydro. They were formerly owned by TransCanada and were sold in, I think, around 2017. And then south of the border in Massachusetts, and if you want to learn more about these next two, join us on January 27th, where Andrea will take over and talk about these facilities. You have the Northfield Mountain Pump Station and Turner's Falls Dam in Massachusetts. These are owned by a different company, First Light. The four facilities, not the pump station, have been peaking hydropower facilities, meaning they are passing water through the dam and through the turbines to make electricity. Northfield Mountain Pump Station sucks water out of the river and then puts it in a reservoir and flushes it back into the river to generate electricity. So they're a little bit different in their function. So to dive more into Great River Hydro and those three facilities that we're focusing on today, Great River Hydro, when the facilities were sold, Great River Hydro owns a suite of hydroelectric facilities. So it's many of the facilities, or almost all of the facilities on the Connecticut River in Vermont, New Hampshire, including the 15-mile fall facilities further north than what we're talking about today. And then they also own several facilities on the Deerfield River. Great River Hydro itself is an LLC that is owned by a company called ArcLight out of Boston, which is an investment company. And so we just want to make that clear that the parent company is interested in raising money for folks that have invested in this asset company. So talking about essentially the last 40 years, these facilities have functioned in a way that's considered hydro peaking. And what that means is that, the water coming down the river would be held behind the dam. The impoundment level would go up as that water gets stored. And that at a certain point in the day, when electricity prices generally go up, like in the evening, they would then start to put that water through, generate electricity, and the impoundment would go down. And they would generate for, 3, 4, 5 hours, depending. Sometimes that might occur twice a day. And so what you're looking at here is a graph of, just as an example, the surface water elevation behind the Bellows Falls Dam between June and August. And you can see the surface water elevation change, which corresponds to the amount of water that is getting discharged out of the dam. So that goes up and it goes down, right? In the former, in the past 40 years, that's essentially how the companies have been working. I will pass it off to Katie now to sort of turn our attention to the future and what this looks like, this will look like under the new license.
Well, hi, everybody. Good to be here. Thanks to CRC, Kathy, and Stacy and Andrea for inviting me to participate today. So I'm going to start, with just talking about where we've come from. We've been at this for quite a while. We started, let's see if this will go. There we go. We started the relicensing process back in October 2012 with a scoping process, and then we launched into our study phase. Relicensing processes on paper take 5 to 5.5 years. This one is taking a bit longer for several reasons, some of which are the Vermont Yankee closure. There were 2 government shutdowns. We had some studies that needed to be done. And then, so we had a bunch of information. We had this aquatic resource group of which Kathy and I were part. And this particular group was very much interested in figuring out ways that we could propose to change operations that would benefit the ecosystem while continuing to maintain the value of the hydropower dam for supporting the energy grid. The Nature Conservancy had a partnership with UMass. They did some modeling for us to help us understand this concept of flexibility that the company had said was very important to them. And so we came up with some ideas, proposed those to Great River Hydro, kind of pitched these ideas to Great River Hydro in March. And then in a couple of months, they initiated some discussions with us to talk about this further. Can we include some of these ideas into a proposal for operations? So let's see. Let's keep going. So what were the resource concerns that we brought into the room? Again, this was the Aquatic Resource Working Group. So we were primarily looking at habitat and fish spawning success and movement, and then habitat for riverine fish species, but also, and maybe importantly so, for some of the threatened and endangered species in the system, like cobblestone tiger beetle and dwarf wedge mussel. On Great River Hydro's part, they're of course interested in maintaining their project economic viability, being in compliance with the energy regulatory body, and then having this operational flexibility that's so important to them. And we had, I think, of course, we had these interests at the table, but there were several others that weren't brought to the room, specifically because we were focused on the biology, the aquatic biological resources. But these are also very important. And I just want to acknowledge that this was not the center of this particular discussion. And those include recreation, fish passage, erosion, and cultural resources. And we'll talk about these more a little bit later in the presentation. So here's some model data. I'm a scientist. I love this stuff. This is some of the data that UMass helped to help us understand how the river was functioning right now. So these are modeled current operations. This is not observed data. This is modeled data, but it does align pretty closely. And along this horizontal axis, this is time. So each of these blocks is a period from July to October in 9 different years. So just to look at the variability across different years, we looked at a lot, or at least 9. And then on the vertical axis, that's discharge from the dam. So flow, or just releases from the dam. This is wilder. And as as Kathy said, these facilities hold and release water in response to energy market demand. And so we see that it happens very often. So there's kind of like really, really a lot of up and down. And that corresponds to the daily, sometimes twice daily peaking these projects undergo. And then there's some gaps where water's really low or water's really high. In contrast, we have this other model that USGS provided that gives us an idea about what natural flows would have looked like. So imagine the Connecticut River without any dams. So this is minus any dams in this system. And this gives us an understanding of what the species in the river evolved to. So a lot fewer fluctuations. You can actually see the whole continuous line. Oh, yep, so vertical is CFS. That's exactly right. So discharge in CFS. There's quite a bit of variability among years, but a much smoother flow regime, as we call it. However, there are 3,000 dams in the watershed, so we are not anticipating getting back to natural. So another question we have is, what would the best case scenario be if we wanted to reduce some of this modification and return some of that natural variability to the system? And so these images represent what we call inflow equals outflow. So there are projects upstream that are peaking facilities that are not being currently relicensed. I believe that relicensing ended in the late 90s. I was not around at that point. So we have been thinking about, of course, always have to think about the next period. So they will be relicensed again in now, 15 years. So something to think about, but they still peak. And so we can't do anything about that today, but we can think about what we can do for these facilities. And this is essentially the best case scenario. The water that comes in leaves the dam on an instantaneous basis. So we had a lot of really good discussion with our Great River Hydro team, and these are some of the outcomes that we came up with in those discussions. One thing that we were really pleased with is Great River Hydro agreed to that kind of best case scenario given the current circumstances, which is inflow equals outflow as base operations. This corresponds kind of like, imagine a bathtub where the drain, what's coming in is going out, that water level stays pretty constant. So as a result of the inflow equals outflow, we have steady water surface elevations. And then we did allow for a 1-foot bandwidth there. To account for Great River Hydro's needs, we have some periods of flexible operations, and those vary by season according to the needs, the power needs, and according to the resource needs. So more flexible hours per month in the winter, fewer in the rest of the year when there's more resource concerns. And then we also were really interested in ramping, how quickly the water turns on and off. And so Great River agreed to have a gradual up ramping. In most cases, there's a lot of detail there. We can talk about it later. And then gradual down ramping. So from peaking back to inflow equals outflow in all cases. And then lastly, I can say quickly, when the water is released, the water surface elevation goes down. So we want to make sure that came up relatively quickly. So Great River Hydro agreed to get that back up to that target water surface elevation within 48 hours. So these are some simulations that Great River Hydro provided us to illustrate how these proposed operations might look. And so the red line, there's a lot here, but it's super cool. So bear with me. The red line represents those current operations. So we have that regular peaking. And this is February. So the horizontal axis is time and represents the full month of February. Again, and the vertical axis is discharge in cubic feet per second, or CFS. So the red line is current operations, that daily peaking going low to high every day. The dotted line is the dotted green line is that inflow equals outflow. So water in equals water out. And then the purple line is the proposed operations. So this is winter, where we have the most allowable periods of flexible operations. So in this case, 65 hours. And you can see that the purple line tracks the green line pretty closely, except for those times of flexibility when they peak. And what we see in comparison to the red is higher base flows, fewer peaks, and shorter peaks. And then if you look at the top of the graph, this represents water surface elevation, where the lower dark blue line is current, so a lot wider fluctuations and a lot more frequent. And then the lighter blue line is the proposed operation, so much steadier and fewer fluctuations. And again, this is winter, so this is kind of the most flashy that the system will be, because this is the most allowable flexible operations. To show you another time period, so in comparison, this is an example of August. This is a relatively wet August. We did look at a range of months and water conditions, dry to wet. This is a kind of a wet August. And again, the purple line tracks the green line pretty closely, except for those times of flexible operations. And August has 20 hours of flexible operations. And then again, looking at that water surface elevation, the comparison between current and the proposed is pretty striking when I first saw this. So we're anticipating very steady water surface elevations, which is pretty exciting. So let's see, just to recap, we, TNC and CRC and the other stakeholders really do consider this a win for the river. There will be a significant improvements to flows that benefit the ecosystem. In turn, these improvements in flows will really improve aquatic habitat, both upstream and downstream. And we really think that these steady water surface elevations will address some of the other issues like erosion in the impoundment. And Kathy will speak more to that here in a minute. And then at the same time, the facility is able to maintain their energy and economic value. So these projects are valued for their ability to turn on when the energy regulators ask them to, and when they're needed to maintain grid stability. And under this proposal, they are still able to do that. So that's pretty exciting that we have this pretty incredible win. And for the Nature Conservancy, balancing renewable energy needs with ecosystem needs is really important to us. So this is a really great example of how we can do that. As a reminder, however, there are issues that are not covered here. Erosion, we are hopeful to some degree, but there are others too that were definitely not discussed. And the Nature Conservancy's position here is awesome. We're really happy about this flow regime, this proposed flow regime. We still need to be sure that fish passage issues are addressed, and we're working with our resource agency partners, understand how that is going. They're in discussions with Great River Hydro currently, I believe. And then for these other issues, it's really important to the Nature Conservancy that we find creative solutions to make sure that all of the users of the river are able to ensure that they have continued use of these resources. And oh, it's fine. Kathy is going to go ahead and describe some of these additional issues and the approach that the Connecticut River Conservancy will be taking. So Kathy, hand it over to you.
Thanks, Katie. So, again, I do want to reiterate, I think that this operational change is going to be a profound positive effect on the river, and we're excited about that. We're limited to that specific conversation about that operational change from the perspective of how it affects the aquatic species, and we did not have the opportunity to have conversations to delve into some of the other issues that CRC cares about. And so, you know, I was anticipating you know, as everyone else, when the license came out, there was information in the license that I was not privy to until it was made public. And so I have to say, when I started digging into the license, really looking for like, what else, what other protection, mitigation, and enhancement measures are there going to be? I was really actually quite disappointed in how little additional PM&Es, they're called, or protection measures were included. So the application clearly states that Great River Hydro, as a recreation mitigation, will maintain 3 primitive campsites on the river that are part of the Connecticut River Paddlers Trail. They have been maintaining those campsites, but they're going to make that more formal and bring them into their recreational assets, as it were. We were expecting a lot more, and I'll go into that. They will be operating the fish ladders from April 1st to July 15th, which is a slight expansion of what they're already doing, but not too much of an expansion, but probably what is needed. And then as Katie mentioned, you know, they indicate in the application that they will discuss additional fish passage requirements with resource agencies. Ideally, you know, the application, this is the final application, that the details of those decisions should be in this application for the public to be able to comment on, and they are not there. And so to a certain extent, from my view, the application is deficient in that this is not already included. And similarly, they discussed developing and signing a programmatic agreement for managing historic resources. That also, there should be details for the public. So over the course of the next several months, FERC will be requesting additional information from the company, and we are hopeful that rapidly some additional details will be provided to the public so that folks can comment on that. So just to dig into these a little bit, you know, Great River Hydro did 2 separate recreation studies, one focused on whitewater and one on kind of infrastructure needs. And then in addition, Connecticut River Conservancy and the Appalachian Mountain Club did a recreation survey in the towns, and then spoke directly to many of the recreation planners and town leaders to find out like what the towns in the project area would like to see for recreational enhancement. And we submitted a list of recommendations to FERC and to Great River Hydro that called out a lot of specific things. You know, Great River Hydro has not indicated, for instance, that they are willing to address the portage issue around Bellows Falls, which is 1.5 mile portage. You know, improvements to fish viewing facilities would be great. That has not been included in this application. So these are some of the things that Connecticut River Conservancy will be advocating for as we comment on this application. Similarly, just a little bit of details about our concerns around fish passage. Vernon Ladder is actually a very, it's a good ladder and it passes fish quite well, but there are some specific enhancements that will make that ladder even better at helping to pass fish upstream. And the fisheries biologists are really looking for safe and effective upstream and downstream passage for our species of concern, migratory species, including American eel, American shad, and sea lamprey. There are some concerns about downstream passage and mortality through some of the turbines that need to be addressed. And then, you know, again, different fish need different passage ways, right? So American eel slithers on their belly, shad swim in the stream. So you know, providing for the details to make sure those fish are passed appropriately. And one of our continued concerns since before 1979 has been the erosion caused by the peaking by the surface water elevation fluctuations. Under this new operational scenario, CRC anticipates that because the surface water elevation will be held stable behind the dam, there will be significantly less of that up and down every day, which should be more protective of our stream banks. And so to us, that is a positive outcome. The one caveat or concern is at the northernmost end of the Wilder pool, that you still have potential you know, peaking inflows coming downstream from McIndoe's, which is also owned by Great River Hydro. And so we would really like to see some analysis or monitoring of that upper end of the impoundment, really of the whole river, ideally, but of the upper end of the impoundment to ensure that that erosive force is being reduced and that we do in fact see less erosion up there as well. And the other thing that, you know, given the profoundness of this operational change for the river, you know, there is the potential for really interesting research, basically, and monitoring of the changes in the river system. So, for instance, you know, all of the tributaries that come into the river in the impoundment areas have been meeting much of the time sort of slow moving or not moving water. And so what that means is the tributaries have dropped their sediment at the mouths of as they enter the Connecticut River over the past 40 years. And so as we start to see more water moving actively through the river, we can expect changes in the tributaries. In terms of like how sediment moves, possibly what kind of bottom habitat is there. And so now is actually like a really opportune moment to monitor this change over the next couple decades, at least, to see how, when you change operations in this way, how a river rebounds really, and what additional benefits may come from it, and being able to track that from a scientific perspective. So, you know, we're coming to the end here. We did it on time. And the thing that, you know, I want to reiterate is this is a public process, and we really need the public to be engaged in this. You know, Connecticut River Conservancy and TNC, like, we have been engaged and we are commenting, but we really need our townspeople, organizations, and individuals to, you know what's going on and be willing to step up and speak up for your river and what you want in your communities. So the ways to go about doing that are to sign up for the FERC docket to begin to get what comes out of FERC on these facilities. We're expecting, in terms of the timeline, that FERC will be requesting additional information from Great River Hydro, as I said, in the next month or two. And then there'll be a point at which they deem the application complete, which we expect will be sometime after May. And at that point, individuals and organizations can intervene and comment and submit formal comments on this final revised application. And so you can basically tell FERC what you would like to see and what you want for your river. And then in addition, once that application is deemed complete, there is a corollary process in the states where each state has the right to develop a water quality certificate, which will provide requirements in the license. And so there will be a public process in both Vermont and New Hampshire and Massachusetts to take additional input from the state's perspective. And so, being aware and being involved in that process and commenting would be good also. And then ultimately, there will also be an environmental impact statement prepared by FERC, and you can comment on that as well. So, after this, we will send a follow-up email with links to our website with ways to kind of dig into the details of this. And Andrea and I are standing by, glad to help you work through figuring out how to do this. Contact us often. So all in there's our contact information, and then we can open it up to questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Kathy and Katie. I just wanted to reiterate, no need to necessarily write all these email addresses down. Everyone here will get all of this later today, the follow-up with all the resources, links, etc. So reminder to please put your questions in the chat because there's a lot of people here. It's pretty impossible to raise hands. So I'm going to start with an earlier one. Can you talk about the specific criteria used to measure whether licenses are in the public interest?
Sorry, say that again, Stacy.
Can you talk about the specific criteria used to measure whether licenses are in the public interest?
Andrea, maybe you want to field that one.
Well, I guess it's sort of a low bar, the public interest question, which we found out when we were commenting on sort of a corporate restructuring of First Light, that it's really, for this proceeding and FERC, it's really about whether the companies are proficient and capable of running the facilities. So it's not what you sort of instinctively feel is the public interest.
I'll add that that's why it's important, that graph that Kathy showed with all the different regulatory authorities kind of looped in. We really depend on those to ensure that, you know, it's more than just energy interests that the public are concerned with.
Great.
I'll jump in and also mention, this is another question that just came to me privately, so that everybody wouldn't have seen this, but the question was, why are the contracts or the FERC licenses 30 to 50 years long? Has there been any advocacy to have the length of the contracts changed, particularly moving forward with climate change and that sort of thing? The public needs opportunity to ask the holders of the licenses to change to meet and support the needs of the environment. I'll take a stab at some answers to that, and the 30 to 50 year time frame is something that's stated in the Federal Power Act, so it would take an act of Congress to change that time frame, which can be a heavy lift to do anything really, but and I think from the project owner standpoint, what I've heard is, you know, if you're going to ask them to put in a $10 million fish lift or something, they want stability and know that the sort of goalposts are not constantly shifting for them to put that much of an investment into the license parameters. So I think it's a balance between you know, the length of time that maybe the people would want versus investing in changes to the way that the facilities are operating. I don't know if Kathy and Katie want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I had the same question when I started getting involved in this. Is like, why is that so long? And the answer that I heard is that it's really about the investors. So and that's one reason why new facilities have a longer period. So a brand new facility is going to have a 50-year license because that's the time that's needed to recover the costs of building the facility. Older facilities with fewer investments are going to have shorter timeline because it takes less to recover the costs of relicensing and of the changes. So basically, if you shorten the timeline, there's less likely for investors to want to invest because they won't recoup the costs, that investment cost, and so the facility can't function. So that's how I understood it in a nutshell. Whether that's good or right is another question entirely.
It might be. I think we got a lot of questions, so maybe we move on to the next one.
Sure. What is the connection, enforcement, relationship between the bodies who agree to change operational behavior and systems and those who would actually carry out the agreed changes? In other words, what is the chance the agreements will be implemented, and is there any penalty if they are not? who wants to
Yeah,
start?
FERC is FERC is a regulatory agency, right? So what is ultimately, this operational change is in the application, and it is the preferred alternative by both Great River Hydro and the stakeholders that have been involved in this. Very likely, we expect to see this in the license, but ultimately what ends up going into the license is the regulation that the company must function by under the new license when that starts. And Great River Hydro is a compliant company, right? So they are not, as we work with multiple different hydro companies, you can see who is like a good actor and who is not a good actor in terms of their compliance. If they were out of compliance, there's a process through FERC to be able to complain, and then FERC would address that. Great River Hydro is a compliant company, and I don't have any reason to believe that they are not going to do what is required of them under the license.
This is a little bit related. Echo. But the question is about enforcement and the responsibility to maintain, protect, and guard the recreational facilities. We live next to a mandated boat launch, and it is a continual source of bad behavior and negative impact with no authority to monitor. Vermont troopers say it is private. Great River Hydro claims they are not required to monitor. Combined with the power line, it's a major crime attractant. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So that's a perfect example of something that you would want to comment on. So if this happens to be a Great River Hydro facility that you as a local constituent are having issues with, that would be a comment you want to send to FERC. So they're aware of that and they take that into consideration as they consider the new license.
Great. A question about the fish ladders. You said that the fish ladders have been operating. Does this include Wilder? We have not observed it being operational in recent years.
Right, so the fish ladders were built for Atlantic salmon. And there was multi-year effort to restore the Atlantic salmon to the Connecticut River. And that effort was suspended several years back. So what that means is, the trigger for the Wilder fish ladder to operate currently has to do with the number of Atlantic salmon that pass through the Vernon and Bellows Falls ladder. So as part of these discussions with the fisheries biologists under this new license, the focus has switched to, frankly, being the more comprehensive consideration of multiple migratory species, not just, the Atlantic salmon. So under this new license, the consideration is many species and they're all of their needs. And so that may, depending on what ends up in the license, you may see the Wilder ladder functioning more if it is required to pass shad or American eel or sea lamprey, but that it's a little beyond my fisheries biologist expertise. So at the moment, Wilder has not, the fish ladder has not been open for several years because there are not Atlantic salmon being passed upriver. And so under this new license, we should see this addressing, the migratory fish that we want to support at this moment in time and over the next few decades.
Great. There's a question about the campsites. You mentioned that maintaining the 3 campsites, would that mean others would close or can close is the question.
No, so the Connecticut River Paddlers Trail has been formed by a coalition of multiple landowners, many land trusts, private landowners, Great River Hydro, who have supported these primitive campsites up and down the river. And the idea being that this would be a way to travel the river, on an extended trip from the headwaters all the way down to the Long Island Sound, ultimately. And so Great River Hydro's commitment here is to maintain 3 of those campsites. There are multiple campsites along the river, and the rest of them will continue to be maintained. And based on the recreation that we saw last summer, I can only assume that you would be able, will be seeing more people on the river using those campsites and passing on down the river.
Great. And we will have more information on the Paddler's Trail in a later live stream, so stay tuned for that. And also reminding folks that we will share all the links and information on the FERC docket in the email. That was another question. Did the hydro operator or anyone else calculate how much the proposed new mode of operation will decrease the power company revenues?
I'll take this one.
Yeah.
I would say, of course, the hydro operator did calculate that, and that's how they knew that they'd be able to do this. The model that we use with UMass did estimate the cost of that inflow equals outflow, and then did estimate, you know, some scenarios under this flexible operation, and so if we did strict inflow goes outflow, that we estimated about a 10% reduction in annual revenue strictly from generation revenue. And this is really important because the one thing that we learned is that the company actually gets a lot of revenue through what's called reserve payments. So these facilities are super important to the ISO, the energy regulator, for being ready to come on demand. So they're valued because they're fast start facilities. And they're very important for keeping the grid stable. And so they get paid for just being held in reserve. And then the other piece of that is when we added in flexibility, we were amazed at, you know, how much value the company can continue to provide to their economic value in a short amount of time. So like there are really windows of really high energy value where they make a big proportion of their revenue. So we don't have an exact number, but it's somewhere between 0 and 10. I think.
Well, I'll say in the application, there isn't an economic analysis as part of the application. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think what they provided was a comparison between 2019 revenues, and it was just a 1% reduction between a current scenario and the new scenario. So,
Great.
You know, I don't. Based on that, I don't think there is a large economic impact for this operational change.
That's good. It's good that the company was so forthcoming. Those are good answers. Thank you.
Great. Has Great River Hydro tested the operating changes in real time? Yes, there was a period in the summer when they, I think, attempted at least for a week or something to run this to kind of test how this would go. So yeah, I mean, they've as we went through our conversations, they did their due diligence to make sure that they can do this and that it's in their best interest from an economic perspective and an you know, an electricity generation perspective, that it is functional and workable. I don't want to speak for them. I mean, so I don't, you know, that's why I'm. Sure.
We could ask Matt to respond. Anyway, next question.
Okay. Are there any interveners addressing historical preservation?
Both the Vermont and New Hampshire offices of historic preservation, over the course of the past 8 years, they have commented. I fully expect that those offices will be engaged and comment. I don't know if there will be, you know, how those additional discussions might go to work at the details of the historic properties management plan. In addition to that, you know, there are in our area, the Abenaki tribes are interested in the impacts of the river, and I know there are representatives of those tribes that have been involved in the discussions and will also likely be commenting. So yeah, did that answer the question?
How about at the town level? Historical commissions in New Hampshire and Vermont, are there such things the way there is in Massachusetts?
I don't know. I mean, there's so many towns involved, and I don't remember from the previous comments and stuff if there may have been some towns who did comment and have been involved in the process. But I think for the most part, it's been the states involved. But again, if there's a historic consideration, you know, this is a public process and people should comment with their concerns.
Great. Will the new, more stable inflow-outflow regime apply to heavy storm events? Don't they also have responsibility to downstream communities and liability concerns about downstream infrastructure?
I'll take this one. That's a really good question. So a couple of things that are important to note that there are, so when inflows get over a certain amount, things shift. So they go under what's called flood profile operations. That said, that is primarily to deal with upstream impacts. So the impacts of flooding in the upstream portion of particularly Wilder Reservoir. These facilities are technically not flood control facilities. So there are 14 plus other dams in the watershed that are responsible for maintaining storm events. So essentially when water gets over a certain amount, it just goes over the dam, and we rely on those flood control facilities to do their job, basically. I don't know if that answers that question fully, but that is a good question.
Great. Here is a comment rather than so much of a question around framing of questions around enforcement. I highly encourage people to educate themselves on the ways in which behaviors, particularly behaviors in relations to landscapes and natural resources, are historically and contemporaneously racially criminalized. Enforcement feels reactive rather than proactive. I wonder if there is a way, sorry, it's jumping on me. I wonder if there's a way to think about policing by law enforcement and for-profit corporations of our natural resources to address some of CRC's interests in culture and recreation. If anyone wants to brainstorm with me ahead of the public comment period, you're welcome to send me an email. This is Robert Eastman. Does anybody want to say more about that, Kathy or Katie?
I think that's a whole other ball of wax. So it's sort of time for another conversation, because there's a lot of, when you're thinking about access to the river, there's a lot of different, this is less about this particular relicensing and more about the multi-jurisdictional control over access sites and who has control over them and funding and a lot of stuff. So we have to save that conversation, I think, for another time. But yeah, I agree. There are definitely some considerations in terms of how, how those things could be addressed more proactively as opposed to sometimes how we have done it in the past.
Great. I'm going to try and fit in one or two more questions here. And again, invite people to ask questions by email or phone to our presenters after this.
And I also, sorry, Stacey, I'll just say, I am glad to, for planning commissions or select boards, or, I'm glad to come and present and help unpack this for other organizations. So, if people can certainly reach out to me to ask, to try to set up a time, and I'm glad to present this at other meetings so that more people can understand the details of this process.
Great. Okay, let's try. Here's another one. In order to have greater control over the characteristics of the flow regime, is there language in the document that will require the power company to add battery storage to their interface with the grid as battery technology improves?
We looked at battery
That's a
storage.
great question.
Yeah, Katie, you want to answer it?
Go ahead, I could follow up.
We looked at battery storage as we were, realizing that what we wanted to see for the river was really inflow equals outflow, right? That the most natural kind of flow regime. We were, in our own thinking, we're acknowledging that made a major economic impact on the company's ability to access the capacity market, right? Which is different than the money you get from just generating electricity as it goes through the turbine. So in trying to help, solve that problem, we, did some analysis and reached out to a consulting firm to look at this idea of adding battery storage to these facilities. And interestingly, this idea has been taken up by some of the other hydro relicensing processes around the country. So the Alabama Rivers Alliance included this as a potential study in that relicensing effort in Alabama, which FERC approved, to have them look into this as an opportunity to move away from peaking hydropower. In this scenario, we suggested this to Great River Hydro, and I think, that is something that maybe they would consider in the future. But in the meantime, we ended up, we were able, and Great River Hydro, I really should say, was able to find a different pathway forward, which is the one that was included in the license that essentially accomplishes that, right? So we're moving the river to inflow equals outflow most of the time. And they figured out how to do that without needing to rely on battery storage to maintain those revenues. Stacy, you're muted.
Thank you both. I think we're going to need to close it for now and just remind folks that you can continue to have this discussion by email or phone call. And we're going to have our next live stream on January 27th with Andrea Donlon sharing more about the Massachusetts facilities. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you learned a lot about these important hydro issues and how you can raise your voice for action. Special thanks to Katie Kennedy for sharing her time and expertise with us, and to Katie and Andrea for always helping to make this work understandable and accessible. And to all the folks who are at the table during these relicensing proceedings, we are grateful for your advocacy. So thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.